Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Done It Hard Gaming.
Yep, Dunnit's been with us for a little bit now. He's a good dude.
And we just found out a trucker. I had to go and double check, but he's been listening to us on the binge style on the road. Shout out to any truckers out there who are saturating their ears with our weird voices. Today we're going to be talking about the Zimmerman telegram. And this is something that I got interested in as sort of a sidebar from my previous episode, Tony. It's actually the better known bad idea, but it came up in the context of Warren G. Harding and the war effort in World War I. And the story of the Zimmerman telegram really kicks off in 1917. In 1917, the Great War had been raging in Europe for 3 years, and Germany was in trouble. The war they'd expected to win easily had become a quagmire, and if something didn't change soon, they would be at risk of losing everything. Now, the obvious solution was to step up their naval game against the British. The British were an impressive naval force at the time, just by an obvious outgrowth of the fact that they were an island and they had to have a bunch of ships just to do anything. But the Germans had a way of checking German naval power, and that was the U-boats. German U-boats were a terror to all other seagoing vessels, but Germany had been playing the naval game so far with one hand tied behind their back. You see, ever since the sinking of the Lusitania, a passenger ship that had also been carrying munitions of war, Germany had been on shaky ground with the way they had to operate their submarine warfare. And the reason for this was the Lusitania had American passengers on it. Now, in Germany's defense, before they sank the Lusitania, they told everybody they were going to sink the Lusitania. They took out like a full-page ad in the newspaper right next to the place where you would see the shipping times for the ships, and they were like, listen, you Americans who are about to get on this ship, we think that there's probably some munitions on this ship. We're probably going to take action against it. Why don't you just stay home? And the Americans, some of them got on there anyway. That didn't really stop the Americans from being mad when the Germans sank the ship that had our people on it.
Yeah, and it's also one of those things where people in Washington are going to exploit that, even if they did try to do it in that way.
It turns out politics is politics always, Tony. If you can make it spin your way, you make it spin as hard as you can.
And that's not defending the Germans. They still killed a bunch of people on that boat.
Well, again, there were munitions on there as well, so it's a weird gray area. The British were trying to skirt around like, hey, how you come you guys are firing on civilians? And the Germans are like, you guys can't just stick your guns with like 5 civilians and then say, well, you can't shoot at us because we've got civilians. It's the same thing as when ISIS like puts their rocket launchers inside of a mosque and then they're like, how terrible is it that you've blown up our mosque? Well, you have a rocket launcher in there. You gotta pick one. It can't be military and civilian. It has to be one or the other. So the result of this sinking and the Germans' desperate need for America not to get into the war was that they had made a treaty with President Woodrow Wilson, where they said, listen, we will no longer do unrestricted submarine warfare. We will conduct ourselves in such a way that we'll hail the ships before we fire on them, we'll board them and try to get people to safety if they have civilians on. And the upshot of this, practically speaking, was that the Germans just weren't able to shoot at a lot of the boats that they wanted to shoot at. The benefit of having a submarine is you can sneak up on them and just fire at them out of nowhere. And this treaty essentially said, no, you have to like wave your arms and tell them that you're there and ask for permission to come aboard, and then the essential utility of your submarine is basically nil. So the Germans decide to go all out against Britain. They're going to break this treaty they have with Woodrow Wilson. They are going to engage in unrestricted submarine warfare like they were before. And they know that they're breaking this agreement. And they know that there's at least a strong possibility that this is going to lead to the Americans getting into the war. They need a plan. They need something to keep the Americans occupied while they finish off Great Britain and the rest of the Allies once and for all. And this is what they come up with. They think to themselves, if the Americans were tied up in another war besides the war over here, maybe they wouldn't have the will or the resources to send people to fight in Europe. And there seemed to be a country that was an excellent candidate to have a distraction war with America, and this was Mexico. At this time, the American forces were already engaged with the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa, with General Pershing leading the U.S. military on raids into Mexico in an attempt to retaliate against the rebel leader after the Battle of Columbus. And it's worth pointing out, this isn't the first time the Germans used this strategy in the war. They didn't just fight on the battlefield. They thought to themselves, we have these countries that we are striving against in war. If we can do things that will destabilize them from other sectors, that would be beneficial to us. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, for instance, in Great Britain, they helped to foment a lot of discontent in Ireland that would actually ultimately, after the war, result in Ireland becoming its own independent country. They took action to bring communist revolutionaries to Russia and essentially funded and supported the Bolshevik Revolution, which took Russia as a player out of the war for Germany.
And completely changed the next 100 years of Russia's history.
Yeah, it didn't work out for them in the long term. Like, they ended up having problems with Russia again with the same guys that they installed. But that's down the road.
That's a story for history, like, over and over again. We are Osama bin Laden, then all of a sudden Osama bin Laden's, like, blowing up buildings in America. It just keeps happening. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy is also your enemy.
Especially once you've given them big guns.
Yes.
So Germany has this plan to tie America up with a war with Mexico, and now all they have to do is to get in touch with the Mexican government. But that's not as easy as you might think, Tony. Today, everything is super connected. There's a million ways that you can get a message to somebody. There's emails and satellites and radio waves and I don't even know, shortwave. Like, it's unthinkable the number of millions of different ways you could possibly connect with somebody in today's environment. But back then, there is some communication, but it's still very limited. We're talking about telegraph and maybe some radio. And the way the Germans decide to connect with Mexico, the way they decide to contact these guys, is using the transatlantic cable. Now, the Germans had a transatlantic cable laid before the start of the war, but almost immediately the British found it and cut it. Again, we're talking about a very limited number of countries that are capable of doing this. It's a massive undertaking to lay a whole giant piece of pipe, essentially, going all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and Britain just cuts it. And so far in the war, Germany has been using the Americans as their relay. They have a deal with the Americans where they say, listen, will you send our diplomatic messages across the Atlantic if we need it? And the Americans said, yeah, sure, you can use our cable. Britain's not going to cut that one. One little caveat, you do need to just transmit in plain text, because we don't want to be in the kind of position where we're sending a message to one of our enemies, maybe for you, that might hurt us. We'd like to read the messages that you're sending. Is that cool? And Germany said, yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
I mean, you'd still be able to use coded language and all that, but that just seems like such a strange idea to be like, okay, we're gonna try to send these telegrams unencrypted across.
Well, they didn't. They weren't quite that dumb. They're dumb in this story, Tony, but they're not. They're like, we can't just send a message open to Mexico through American hands saying, hey, you guys want to attack America? We'll give you like New Mexico and Arizona. How about it, guys? So they use the brilliant tactic of going to the U.S. ambassador and asking really nicely if they can just encrypt this one message. And the U.S. ambassador's like, yeah, why not? I don't see a problem with it. Sure, go for it.
I'm just thinking, like, this could have been solved if you took, like, a U-boat and a letter across the ocean. Then again, I don't know if the range on a U-boat was actually good enough to get across.
It wasn't, and you might make it, potentially, but you gotta remember, again, I think you are underestimating in this the domination that the British had on the Atlantic Ocean. Nothing was going across from the German side. The Germans were not getting physical boats through. Now, again, maybe there's a way if you really work hard that you can get but they didn't do that, okay? That's not what they did. They went with this, the Americans let them send this one coded message, they go ahead and send it, and it goes through just fine. And the only problem is that unbeknownst to the Germans and the Americans, the British were intercepting all of the messages sent across the American transatlantic cable, or at least all the messages coming from the U.S. Embassy. And furthermore, the British secretly had the keys, at least partially, to the German code books in their possession, which meant they were able to decode the message. Now, this presents the British with an interesting problem, because they want to give this message from Germany to Mexico, trying to get Mexico into a war with the United States, to the United States. But they can't do it without telling the Americans that their line is bugged, and telling the Germans, indirectly at least, that they have the code to break the message that the Germans sent. So they have to come up with a plan. And this is actually a really interesting spy movie kind of twist in this story, because what they come up with is really brilliant. They think to themselves, okay, the message got over to the other side. It's going to Mexico. We know that the Mexicans will send this message over commercial telegraph lines, and we also know that they will re-encode it using an older code book, because the Mexicans at the time did not have the up-to-date newest code book that the Germans were using. So essentially what the British do is they contact a British agent in Mexico and have him intercept the telegraph message again in Mexico, decode that, and show that to the Americans. So they've got this great cover story. They've done a lot of work to make sure that the Americans do not find out that they've got their lines bugged, which they don't, by the way, for another 20 years. America doesn't find out that Great Britain is listening to all their calls, and they avoid letting the Germans know that they have their codes, so then the Germans keep transmitting in the same codes, and Britain can keep decoding them. They run into a problem, though, because when they show the message to the Americans are like, there is no way. This is not a real thing. Why in the world would Germany go to Mexico and ask Mexico to go to war with us? That's a stupid, stupid plan. And the reason that the Americans said that was because it was a stupid, stupid plan.
If they would have been able to do it with another form of communication and Mexico actually took that, I could see it being a good plan. But they just did so bad with the logistics of it. It's like, send a spy in a banana boat back to Central America, like something. There's a way.
I think you're underestimating the fact that the British really do have all of the naval stuff locked off. There aren't banana boats happening. To Germany, at least, or from Germany.
Oh, that's why you have one of your spies go to Africa and just go over in a boat from there. There's got to be some sort of different trade route happening. They were just lazy.
That could be, Tony. But in addition to their laziness, the plan also doesn't make sense, because Mexico is not gonna get into a war with America. It's 100 years later, but really things are essentially similar as far as power dynamics. Mexico knows we're way bigger than they are. At this time, all of the munitions factories for anybody building, like, bombs and artillery and, major weapons of war, all of that stuff is located in the United States. So if Mexico has any of that stuff, they're buying it from the US. Mexico has just been through a massive civil war. In fact, I mentioned earlier that Americans were pursuing Pancho Villa across the border, but Pancho Villa isn't a representative of the government of Mexico. He's one of the revolutionaries. Woodrow Wilson actually has recognized the government that Pancho Villa is fighting against. So those guys aren't necessarily that interested in rocking the boat. If the Americans will leave them alone as much as possible, things could at least go okay. So even if this had gone off flawlessly, there's no way that Mexico would have entered the war.
See, that's one thing I didn't know about the political climate at the time, is that just how bad things were in Mexico. Like, that was just something I hadn't really thought about before, that they were probably a complete mess, because it was kind of a cycle of civil wars for a good part of the 19th century in Mexico. Is a lot of civil wars.
Yeah, and it's fine that you didn't think of it, Tony, but you'd think that maybe the Germans, who were counting on this to work and keep the U.S. out of the war, they might have thought of that. It's possible you say to yourself, okay, it's a roll of the dice. They're getting kind of desperate. They've tried this in a lot of other places and it's worked, and it's sort of a low cost. If they go for it, great. We'll send over a few military advisors, and really that's it, because it's not like we're going to get giant boats full of munitions over there because of the aforementioned several times naval blockades. But Mexico will essentially be on their own, and that'll tie up maybe some American forces. If it doesn't work, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Yeah, in Russia and in Ireland, it's a little bit of a low risk, high reward type situation. It's like they're already pissed at you, they're already at war with you. What's the worst that's going to happen?
Well, that's an important part of this equation, Tony, because, again, America at least has a way not to believe this. There is a significant portion of Americans who are saying, this is not real. There's no way the Germans are going to be this stupid. And that could have been it. In spite of everything, Germany, it looks like, can be off the hook for this nonsense, for their weird blunder where they're like, we're going to get Mexico to fight America. Wasn't going to happen, but okay. Like, wipe the sweat off your brow, breathe a sigh of relief, and say, yep, that wasn't us. Boy, what a crazy story the British have concocted to get you Americans into the war. But that is not what happened, Tony, because Arthur Zimmerman, the German State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, opened his big mouth and sealed Germany's fate. When asked about the telegram by an American journalist, he replied, I cannot lie. It is true.
See, you're a politician. It's your job to lie sometimes. You just be like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's an incredible a level of incompetence. You really think that us, the Germans, are capable of that?
The fact that he doesn't, I can't imagine what is going through this guy's head. I want to come out, by the way, in support of honesty in all cases, really. Honesty is a good policy, it seems like, but just from the perspective of how politics works, it seems like the kind of thing where you at least default to a lie, and then if you get caught in the lie, it's like, well, we're also killing a bunch of people in a war.
Yeah.
So,
honesty, in this instance, gets a lot more people dead.
And that is exactly what happens, Tony. There was, at the time, a strong pro-German presence in American politics, something that cannot be overstated and is difficult to understand, especially in light of how we have thought about Germany since World War II. I think World War II Germany really has colored our lens of how we think about Germany going back in history at least a little bit, but World War I and World War II are not the same. And there is a significant faction of people in America. I guess there was for World War II, actually.
There were even towns up until like World War II where they had a lot of newspapers in German and lots of German immigrants in certain locations. So it was something where it wasn't even like super clannish. That like you had those weird rallies at Madison Square Garden where like Nazi flags are up before World War II starts. There's a lot of weirdness that happened before it kind of got crystallized as to how bad they were.
So politically speaking, even if there was suspicion that it was real, America could have stayed out up until Zimmerman admits, oh yeah, that was us. Yep, sorry guys. No big deal, right? But it was a big deal. America got into the war, and the scales were, in my opinion, decisively tipped against Germany. There are some people who would argue that Germany would have lost eventually, regardless of whether America got into. I'm America hoorah kind of guy, so I like the idea that we made a difference. But it definitely didn't help Germany that we came over there with a bunch of fresh troops after years and years of quagmire and sort of put a jolt in the other direction.
Not to mention, one of the biggest problems with World War I is that you had so many troops that were just chewed up and destroyed, and as generals tried to learn the new type of warfare that was happening. And like the Americans got to come in there learning from all of the things that the British and everybody else had made huge mistakes with, like at the Battle of the Somme and so many others. So you had new troops that weren't shell-shocked, that weren't dealing with all this, that had better battle tactics.
Go America! We're cool. If you're from somewhere else, that's cool too. It's not as cool as us.
We have a lot of listeners all over the place. Like even like Africa's lighting up as far as like most of the countries there being filled.
Speaking of other countries, another result of this particular bad idea was a solidification of distrust between America and Mexico. This is when the border really starts to become fortified as you guys don't come over here, we don't go over there. There is the Battle of Nogales that takes place in 1918, and basically what happens here is that an already pretty shaky relationship is made even more so by this. And and like most historical events, is still having an effect on us today, Tony. But that is it. That is all I have about the Zimmerman telegram. You can see how they got into the situation, kind of. As a cheap tactic for distracting your opponents, supporting their opponents isn't half bad, but they severely overestimated Mexico's potential for doing anything or even being willing to enter a war with the United States. And they really blundered by just openly admitting that they had sent this telegram to start a war between America and Mexico.
I like that one statement that he made was enough to make this called the Zimmerman telegram. Was he the one who drafted it in the first place, or was he just the one who screwed it up?
He wasn't the Secretary of State, but it was sort of similar to that. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs. I didn't actually find too much about him personally in researching this story. There's the limits of time, and you're trying to chase down the more interesting stuff. He just seems to have been one of the state officials who was in charge, and he may have been the guy who sent the telegram. He may have even been the person who came up with the plan, but it didn't seem like so much that it was tied personally to him as it just got the name the Zimmerman telegram because he sent it and he was sort of the face of the Foreign Affairs Department in Germany. I could be way wrong on this. As always, when you're listening to our shows, we are not actual historians. We're just guys who are interested in seeing what we can learn from the history that we can dig up.
We also do like it if you guys send us corrections to our badideasshow@gmail.com. Also, new ideas for shows are very, very much welcome at that email address.
Yes. And with that, I think we will wrap this up. That is all I have for the Zimmerman telegram. Thank you guys so much for listening. As Tony mentioned, we do enjoy getting your messages, and we love the people who are able to support us over on Patreon. You get the little shout outs at the beginning of all of our videos and podcasts and stuff like you heard Done It get earlier, and you get access to the bonus podcast, which is just us sort of free-forming about whatever. There's no research that goes into that. So if you want to hear us be even more wrong, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Human Echoes. We will see you guys next time with another bad idea. Take care, y'all.
Bye, everybody.